I totally committed in my mind that I would be Protestant for the rest of my life because I wasn't going to convert without my husband. And that was really difficult, having to swallow the pill that I might never partake of the Eucharist, and that I might not ever experience fully what I had read about and embraced in my own mind and in my own heart. It was Christ's love, Christ being present in the Eucharist, Christ wanting to sanctify me, Christ calling me to this life of holiness that compelled me to open my heart to the possibility that the Reformers were wrong. Today I want to kind of talk about more of my personal journey into the Catholic faith. I want to give kind of the more internal struggles that I faced and ultimately what God used to open my eyes and help me see things that I had never seen before. For a little bit of background, me and my husband were Calvinists for 8 years. We grew up independent Baptists, and then while my husband was a youth pastor, he had a friend who introduced him to Calvinism, and that is when we kind of made the jump into the Calvinist world. Now, I was really against Calvinism at the beginning, but I struggled greatly with having assurance of my salvation in the Baptist world. And one day my husband said to me, I think that Calvinism could help you with your assurance. And I wanted to have relief and to be done with doubting so much that I allowed that to let my guards down, and I started consuming a lot of Calvinist material. As I was listening to sermons and reading books, I started to realize that I didn't have any answers for the questions that they would give. I couldn't explain Romans 9 as a Baptist. I had no idea what it meant. So when I was given answers from a Calvinistic perspective, Calvinists are very good at making everything seem logical. It all fits in a system. They connect the dots in a very particular way, and that was very appealing. And it made sense. Like everything they said made sense. And, I just thought, well, this is the answer. If faith is a gift from God, I can just stop worrying about if I have faith. If God's going to give it to me, then I can rest in the fact that I even believe in God, because for the Calvinists, if you have that initial fruit, that is the evidence that you have been regenerated. Now, in the Baptist world, I had never heard of the term regenerated, but in Calvinism, regeneration precedes faith. And you've been regenerated because you are exercising faith. So my husband was right when I understood that if you have faith, that automatically means that you are regenerated in the Calvinist world. That freed me. We became Reformed Baptists. We moved back to Florida, and we were in the Reformed Baptist world for about 3 years. But even as someone who embraced Calvinism completely, I still struggled with the problem of evil. And that was always in the back of my mind. I was always looking for answers to that question. If God decrees all evil, how is he not evil? And so, I wrestled with that, but at the same time, I was wholeheartedly a cage stage Calvinist. I knew that it was true. From the bottom of my heart, I knew it was true. And a few years in, maybe not quite a few years, but a little while after being in the Baptist world, I realized there was a category of false Christians within the Reformed tradition. They have this idea that there is people who, for all intents and purposes, seem to be Christians. And they look the part, they profess Christ, they themselves think that they love God and that they're saved. But in the secret counsel of God, they're not elect, and it's all just kind of a deception, honestly, from God, that he's allowing them to believe that they're a Christian. He's allowing them to taste of all of the good things that come from God, and in the end, they're not a Christian, and they go to hell, and God judges them even more harshly than he does an unbeliever. So as soon as that idea was implanted in my brain, The same cycle that I had gone through in the independent Baptist world of, scrutinizing my faith and did I have true faith? Was it genuine? That started again. Except this time, how could you ever know? You can never know if you are truly a Christian because you won't find out until the end when God's burning you with special fire because you despised his gifts, which is a whole another story for another day. I started struggling again with my assurance, and we became Presbyterian. We're convinced of infant baptism, found a Presbyterian church. My husband became a youth pastor. The church there was putting him through seminary, and he, I believe he finished 2 years of seminary. He was on his way to become a pastor in the PCA. And during this time, right as my husband started his ministry again and became enrolled in seminary, a friend posted a video by an Orthodox priest, Father Josiah Trenum, called Rock and Sand. And I listened for 2 hours as Father Trenum went on and on about the Reformation and what the Reformers did, and talking about history in a way I had never thought about. And for one, I never heard of Eastern Orthodoxy. Those words had never even come across my lips. And I was really ignorant to church history. I was under the impression that the church was lost in the first century. So, until Martin Luther came and saved us all. So, I'm listening, and this guy's he's making me think about things that I've never thought about before. I had thought that I had the teachings of the early church. I thought we recovered the early church. And here's this man telling me that there's a whole bunch of stuff that I don't know, that I have no clue about. And, I went to my husband and I'm like, what do you think of this? And he was like, I don't know. That sounds crazy. I don't know anything about this. So I asked him if I could read the book Rock and Sand. And so I read the book. And it just opened a wide door of questions. The problems of sola scriptura, the problems with rejecting the authority of the church, and you have to understand the internal crisis that I was already going through. I was already struggling so much with the problem of evil, my assurance, that I had ultimately I had stopped praying. I'd stopped reading the Bible. Anything that made me think about God, I had stopped doing it because I was so tired and mentally exhausted of the scrutiny I was putting myself through and the worry and the anxiety over whether or not I was chosen by God. And I would constantly just be like, my only hope is Christ. Hopefully he has mercy on me, because if not, I'm a goner. And so I really clung to that. I of course went to church, and I did love God. I'm just trying to give you a picture of my mental exhaustion from the way that I am. I tend to scrutinize things like faith and things. I don't remember a time in my life where I was not wanting to know what is true. And wanting to know what is true, not just, in general, but true about God and salvation and life and myself, and yearning for a relationship with God. But how do you have a relationship with somebody that you don't understand and comprehend? And so, Calvinism really muddled the waters for me on understanding who God is. Even as a Protestant, I did put a lot of weight in the authority of what the early church said. And from my perspective, I believed that Calvinism was in the early church. We say Augustine, we would have said Augustine was a Calvinist. And so in my mind, I had to cling to Calvinism as true because I did hold that in my heart and mind that, if the early Christians believe this, it's more than likely it's true. And so I just found myself trying to grasp and wrestle with these concepts and ideas without ever questioning them for the sake of being true, because in my mind they were true if the early church taught them. So as I'm wrestling through the claims that Father Josiah was making, I'm also wrestling through my own theology and what I have believed for 8 years of my life. And I started devouring Orthodox writings, Orthodox theology, trying to understand what they believed. And I was studying Catholicism and trying to understand these two churches that I've believed. Well, I didn't know anything about the East, but as far as Catholicism, trying to understand what Catholics believe instead of relying on what I had been told that they believed. And so I'm reading through these things, I'm listening to Orthodox and Catholic apologists, and I quickly realized that the Reformers changed the language of Christianity. They redefined everything. It took me a while to kind of wrap my mind around what exactly Catholic and Orthodox were saying, because I had different definitions for the theological references that they would make. But I started listening to Lord of Spirits with Father Stephen Damick and Father DeYoung, and they did a really good job about untangling a lot of these ideas that I had in my head and helping me to understand, Orthodox theology. I quickly started to realize that my entire life, no matter where I found myself, it was a shallow shell compared to what I was finding in Orthodoxy and in Catholicism. I felt like I had been robbed of the fullness of the Christian experience and the Christian life. And I don't mean that to bash on Protestants. I think that a lot of Protestants do what they do out of ignorance. They believe what they believe out of ignorance. I was one of them, so I definitely was in that category. But the thing that moved me the most was it untangled my mind from all of the false ideas that I had had about God as a Calvinist. They have the definition of providence not as God meticulously controlling every single situation. And when I say control, I mean that God plans the evil, God wants the evil, but somehow he's not evil. They had a different understanding, and I found that it was consistent with church history, the church fathers, and throughout 2,000 years, they're holding on to this particular view of they are holding on to this particular view of providence that Calvin and the Reformers completely redefined. And another thing that I was really grappling with was the atonement. Penal substitutionary atonement. I struggled as a Calvinist understanding and comprehending penal substitution. In my mind and in my heart, the way that I viewed the cross was that God hated me so much that he had to punish Christ in order to get his hatred of me out. And even in the atonement, after what Christ accomplished in penal substitutionary atonement, it's as if God doesn't really love you. He loves Christ, and because he loves Christ, he kind of covers you over, and he doesn't see you, he sees Christ, he sees the work of his son, and you're just kind of like blanketed over, like, you're just this pile of garbage that's been clothed with the righteous robes of Christ. And so, that was my view of God with the doctrine of imputation and the doctrine of penal substitution. As I was studying early church history, studying Eastern theology, studying the Catholic theology even, I found that their view of the atonement painted a very different picture of God, and it painted a very different process of salvation and what justification actually is. In the West, we tend to conceptualize our salvation or justification in legal terms. And I'm not saying that that's not an aspect of our salvation. God is our judge. But the Reformers, they took that, and it's the only emphasized view that God is the judge above all other views. He's not a father, he's a judge. And so when I'm reading Eastern theology, God is above all. He's a father. I was being given an atonement that had nothing to do with appeasing God, and everything to do with reconciliation and being brought into relationship with God. The cross was about defeating my real enemies, death, sin, and the devil. And it wasn't just about creating some legal fiction where God just declares you righteous. No, He truly makes you righteous through the sacraments of the church and through being involved in partaking of those things. God is truly sanctifying you and making you more and more into the image of God. And the cross is just where it all began. And that's why I love that it's always with the resurrection. The early church always had those two together. It's everything, and it's what drew me in. It's true and good and beautiful, and so much different than the Reformed understanding. I don't have to worry anymore. I don't have to worry if I'm in a category of people that God hates for no other reason than that's the way He created them to be. I can rest for the first time in my life. Because even in the Baptist world, even though they're, not Calvinists, they still have the idea of God of penal substitution and that God is pouring down His wrath on His Son in order to make you savable. And they still have the doctrine of imputation. Christ is just forgiving you on the cross. He doesn't actually change you. He just forgives you and just foregoes your punishment. So when I came into this understanding, I can honestly say that God and Christ filled my heart with love, with His love for the first time. For so long, I have longed for God to love me and to be assured that God loved me, and I knew that He did. And the picture of salvation, that Christ didn't just come to cover me over. I understood that Christ came to change me. Christ came to change us all, and He does that through the church and through the sacraments. And it's a beautiful, beautiful picture. And it has depth, and it gives your life meaning. And, it's just a beautiful picture. And that is initially, I can give all the apologetics that flow out of why, I started being convinced of these things. But if I had to choose one thing that compelled me to believe that Orthodoxy and Catholicism are true, is that they gave me God's love when no other denomination had given me that. Yes, they gave me bits and pieces. But in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, I found a fullness, I found a whole completeness, a depth that it does not exist in Protestantism. Because you need all of it. You need the church, you need a good ecclesiology, you need the understanding of the sacraments, and you need the understanding of living a faithful Christian life, and you need to build that all on a solid foundation of the atonement and what Christ accomplished for you. And all of that was missing for me in Protestantism. It was all jumbled up, and none of it fit. None of it made sense. None of it worked. And I can honestly say that at the end of the day, it was Christ's love, Christ being present in the Eucharist, Christ wanting to sanctify me, Christ calling me to this life of holiness that compelled me to open my heart to the possibility that the Reformers were wrong. After I had embraced, that this was true and I rejected Calvinism, it caused a lot of problems in my marriage. I struggled through these things with my husband for a little while, but they caused too much tension between us. And so I tried to be a faithful wife. I tried to, love my husband well and to honor him and to respect him. And I totally committed in my mind that I would be Protestant for the rest of my life because I wasn't going to convert without my husband. And that was really difficult, having to swallow the pill that I might never partake of the Eucharist, and that I might not ever experience fully what I had read about and embraced in my own mind and in my own heart. But I felt that that was what I needed to do to be faithful to God and to my husband in my marriage. Sorry, excuse me. And for about 6 months, I had resigned that I would never be Catholic or Orthodox. And so I just started praying. And I can say during that time that God really was with me. And He sustained me. And I would pray every time we would take the Lord's Supper in our Protestant church. I would pray that the Lord would have mercy on me and my family, and that by faith that He would allow it to be His true body and blood for me and my family. And I do feel like God met me where I was at. We have a good God who does care about us and who does love us. And He really did. He really did comfort me during that time. And so I was just praying. I prayed that God would bring people into my husband's life that he could talk about these things with that wouldn't cause tension between him and I. And so I just kept to myself, and I just prayed. I just prayed, and I tried not to, go against my husband in any way. And I actually had reached out to a couple of people. Father Stephen Damick was one of them. And I reached out anonymously and I told him my situation. And he encouraged me to just pray and try to look to Mary as my example of being a humble and faithful wife to my husband and a mother. So I focused on that for a good 6 months. Then one day, out of the blue, my husband came to me. And granted, you have to remember, in my mind, I think I'm spending a lifetime as a Protestant. I'm not going to be able to ever come into the Catholic or Orthodox Church because my husband was a very committed Reformed man who was going to be a pastor, and I didn't think there was any way on earth that that was going to change. And he came to me one day and he told me that for 6 months, granted, that's right when I started praying, that he had been debating these things and talking with people and trying to understand and trying to figure things out, and that we were going to go and visit a Catholic church on our vacation. We went on vacation. And we just happened to go to the Immaculate Conception. It's a basilica in Jacksonville. And for two people who had never been in a Catholic church or a Catholic service, all I can say is God was there. We went into the church, and my husband and I both knew immediately we had never felt anything sacred, like being in a holy place. It was a holy place. And we knew Christ was there. And of course, I'm crying, the whole time, because I know what in the world is happening. Like, God has answered my prayer way faster and in a way that I never thought He would. And, I had such small faith. But, being in that service, my husband came out of that service and said, "What have I been doing my whole life? Like, I don't know what that was, but I know that what we have, but I know that what we have had our whole life, it's not cutting it. It's not it." And so we told our pastor, and the pastor told the deacons and elders. Protestants in general, if you disagree with them, it's kind of just an immediate, awkward, you need to go somewhere else. And they don't take it very well, and they tend to take it very personally, and it gets awkward really quick. We pretty much just left, and we've lost a lot of friends that I didn't think we would lose, but we did. And now my husband and I are in RCIA, and our children are thriving. They love it. They know something's different too. And this Easter, me and my family will be brought into the Roman Catholic Church, and I cannot wait to be a Catholic. I can't wait to be a part of the church. And I'm so thankful and so grateful to, that we have a God that answers our prayers and that is with us and that He takes us along and He shows us Himself. And, you know, I've been searching my whole life for fullness, for Christ, for God Himself. Every theological endeavor that I've ever had, it's because I want to know God. I'm hungry to know God. And I had a friend accuse me from our Baptist church when they found out we were Catholic. I had a friend accuse me of just always being on this quest for knowledge. And as uncharitable as that was, I'm not going to take offense to it because I know in the depths of my heart that every ounce of my journey in the Christian world has been in a desire to know God and to know what is true so that I can love God better, so that I can be a Christian and the most faithful Christian that I can be. And, I found that. And I still love Orthodoxy, and I still cherish everything that I learned on my journey from Orthodoxy. And I'm loving the Catholic faith. I'm endeavoring to study and learn more about the Catholic faith. I think it also is beautiful and true. And yeah, so that's pretty much my journey. I'm sorry that I got a little emotional, and I just kind of wanted to share more of the personal experience behind it instead of, apologetics. But I can save apologetics for another time. But I wanted to encourage anyone who might be doubting the shallow emptiness of Protestantism because, there is more. And there is so much more. And it is beautiful and it is true and it makes sense of the whole world and life. And yeah, I'm just really, really excited. And I'm glad that I could share this with you guys today. And thank you for watching. I appreciate all the support I've gotten so far.